worked with Terry back in January of 2008. Terry came up to do a presentation to the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable. Before that, Terry had he's a graduate of Penn State. He has 2 master's degrees. He served at various military parks. Wound up serving at Vicksburg, and that's when I made the connection with Terry. My husband and I had been to Vicksburg and were impressed with, you enter, as you will see on the maps you have, you enter the visitor center. You go around this way and then this way, and there is the Minnesota Monument, and it is spectacular. We spent time there walking around it, examining it, and then when I met Terry a few years later, I commented that the monument at Vicksburg for the Minnesota troops it needed a little spiffing up. The mortar was cracking, there were grass and weeds growing up, and he said he would look into it, and he got back to me with what it would cost to spiff up that monument. So I went to the board of the Twin Cities Civil War Roundtable, gave them Terry's figures, and the board then approved a grant, not a grant, of $9,200. Terry sent me the costs, we sent him the money, and that summer in 2009, the monument was fixed up. I have here, well, Terry promised he would send me publicity as it appeared. Here is a photocopy from the Vicksburg Post that shows Terry and the superintendent of Vicksburg Military Park at that time in front of the monument. It also explains what was done to the monument, and a small picture here as well. Anybody wants to look at it, I'm sitting over there and have it with me. Terry has written numerous books, articles, but one of the things, pieces of research that I think all of us can appreciate, he wanted to know which military unit entered Vicksburg first. Yeah, it's a minor controversy. He determined that it was the 4th Minnesota that was given the honor of entering Vicksburg after it was captured. And if you've been to the Minnesota State Capitol, with the paintings in the governor's reception room, the picture of the 4th Minnesota entering Vicksburg is on the wall there. So I'm really glad to see Terry again. We cooperated on that project, and I hope all of you who go to Vicksburg stop and spend time looking at the Minnesota Monument. It's spectacular. So, Terry.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Although honored by Rod's kind invitation to be here this morning, I am more deeply honored by your presence. And I thank you for this opportunity to share with one another our love of history. If I may just make one correction to what Sally said. The 4th Minnesota wasn't given the honor, rather they seized the honor. This is the geographic region we'll be talking about today. You see the city of Vicksburg, roughly midway between Memphis on the north and New Orleans on the south. Biographer Lloyd Lewis accurately portrays the Mississippi River in the mid-19th century as being the spinal column of America. He refers to the great river as the trunk of the American tree, with limbs and branches reaching to the Alleghenies, the Canadian border, the Rocky Mountains. For more than 2,000 miles, the river flows silently on its course to the sea, providing a natural artery of commerce, and gliding over the Mississippi's muddy waters were steamers and flatboats of all description, heavily laden with the rich agricultural produce of the land en route downstream to New Orleans and world markets. Indeed, the silent water of the great river was then, as it remains to this date, the single most important economic feature of the continent, the very lifeblood of America. One contemporary wrote emphatically that the valley of the Mississippi is America. Upon the secession of the southern states, and in particular Louisiana and Mississippi, the river was closed to free navigation, which threatened to strangle northern commercial interest. With the advent of civil war, President Abraham Lincoln assembled his civil and military leaders to discuss strategy for opening the river and for ending what he termed a rebellion in the southern states. Seated around a large table, examining a map of the nation, Lincoln made a wide, sweeping gesture with his hand and placed his finger on the map at Vicksburg and said, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." It was the president's contention that we can take all the northern ports of the Confederacy, meaning on the inland waters, yet they can defy us from Vicksburg. It means hog and hominy without limit, fresh troops from all the states of the far south, and a cotton country where they can raise a staple without interference. Lincoln assured his listeners that I am acquainted with that region and know what I am talking about. And as important as New Orleans will be to us, Vicksburg will be more so. I trust you agree. These are powerful statements coming from the 16th president, but they are no exaggeration, for you see, Confederate cannon mounted along the bluffs commanding the Mississippi River at Vicksburg were not only trained on the river, but denied that important avenue of commerce to northern shipping. It is important to further note that Vicksburg was also the connecting link between the eastern and western parts of the Confederacy, what Jefferson Davis referred to as the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. In addition, the city sat astride a major Confederate supply route over which the armies of Braxton, Bragg, and Robert E. Lee received much needed food, clothing, medicine, and ammunition, as well as fresh troops. It was imperative for the administration in Washington to regain control of the lower Mississippi River, thereby opening that important avenue of commerce to enable the rich agricultural produce of the Northwest in particular to reach world markets. It would also split the Confederacy in two, sever that vital supply route, achieve a major objective of the Anaconda Plan, and effectively seal the doom of Richmond. To underscore the significance of the Mississippi River and of Vicksburg in particular, permit me to offer the following statements in support. William T. Sherman, a man destined to play a prominent role in the military operations discussed this morning, wrote, "The Mississippi's source and mouth must be controlled by one government." So firm was Sherman's belief that he wrote, "To secure the safety of the navigation of the Mississippi River, I would slay millions." On that point, I am not only insane, but mad. General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck wrote in similar, direct albeit less eloquent terms, "In my opinion, the opening of the Mississippi River will be to us of more advantage than the capture of 40 Richmonds." And finally, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, himself a resident of Warren County, of which Vicksburg is the county seat, in writing to Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton after the fall of Vicksburg, stated his view. "I thought, and still think, you did right to risk an army for the purpose of keeping command of even a section of the Mississippi River. Had you succeeded, none would have blamed. Had you not made the attempt, few would have defended your course." In order to protect the Mississippi Valley, Confederate authorities established a line of defense which ran from Columbus, Kentucky on the left, overlooking the Mississippi River, through Bowling Green to Cumberland Gap, where the right flank was anchored on the mountains. On the Great River south of Columbus, fortifications were also placed at Island Number 10 that John talked about, and on the Chickasaw Bluffs north of Memphis. 70 miles below New Orleans, two powerful masonry forts, Forts Jackson and St. Philip, stood guard at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Eager to confront the difficult task before them, Union land and naval forces moved with a vengeance from two directions in a massive converging attack to wrestle control of the river from Confederate troops. Driving south from Cairo, Illinois, Federal forces, as John mentioned, seized Forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers respectively, and opened the pathway of invasion to the deep south. Continuing the drive, Union forces gained victory at Shiloh in April, Corinth in May, and having forced the surrender of Island Number 10, seized Memphis in June, and in the process destroyed the Confederate river defense fleet, thus opening the river all the way south to Vicksburg. Moving upriver from the Gulf, what is now the Gulf of America, were the ships of the West Gulf Blockading Squadron, commanded by then Flag Officer David Glasgow Farragut. His ships bombarded and passed Confederate forts Jackson and St. Philip and captured New Orleans in late April. With initial success behind him, Farragut sent an advance flotilla upriver. Baton Rouge fell to the Federals on May the 8th, Natchez, Mississippi 4 days later, and the flotilla continued north toward Vicksburg. After the fall of New Orleans, as the Union pincer slowly closed along the river, the Confederates began to fortify Vicksburg. The city's geographic location made it ideal for defense. Equally important, existing rail lines which connected Vicksburg with Jackson and via Jackson points elsewhere in the Confederacy enabled the shipment of heavy ordnance to the Hill City. It was not long before Vicksburg became known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and it would prove a very tough nut to crack. The strategic significance of Vicksburg greatly increased after the fall of Memphis, as it then became the northernmost point below Memphis where the bluffs met the river. It was only a matter of time before war in all its horror centered on Vicksburg. Initial efforts by Union land and naval forces to capture Vicksburg and open the great waterway to navigation ended in failure. The first threat developed on May the 18th, 1862, when the ships of the West Gulf Blockading Squadron arrived below Vicksburg and demand was made for the city's surrender. In terse words, that demand was refused. Lieutenant Colonel James Autry, the post commander, replied that Mississippians don't know and refuse to learn the meaning of surrender. If Admiral Farragut thinks he can teach them, let him try. Well incensed, federal authorities opened fire upon the city and maintained an intermittent bombardment from late May all through June and into late July, but to no avail. The bombardment was ineffective, and Farragut's fleet, racked with sickness and plagued by rapidly falling waters, withdrew to New Orleans and deeper waters. It was then and there realized by both Union and Confederate high commands that if Vicksburg were going to fall, it would be at the hands of a massive combined land and naval effort. The batteries which overlooked the Mississippi River at Vicksburg were powerful, indeed formidable, but all of the land accesses were open. The decision was made to construct a line of defense around the city, which would guard the roads and railroad access to Vicksburg. The responsibility for design and construction of what became known as the rear line of defense was assigned to Major Samuel Lockett, chief engineer of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. Lockett, a graduate of West Point class of 1859, in which he stood second, was a highly skilled and well-trained engineer who set about his task with vigor. Reconnoitering through the hills and hollows around Vicksburg, Lockett quickly realized that the city was a natural fortress due to a series of narrow ridges fronted and backed by deep, steep ravines. Vicksburg was indeed a natural fortress which he planned to make even stronger by the construction of field fortifications. The line, as constructed, consisted of 9 major forts connected by a continuous line of trenches and rifle pits. The line formed a huge semicircle or backward C around Vicksburg, the flanks of which rested on the Mississippi River above and below the city. It would ultimately be manned by a garrison of 30,000 troops, mount 172 big guns, and posed a major obstacle to Union domination of the Mississippi River. Late that same year, a two-pronged federal advance on Vicksburg met with disaster. Major General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Union Army of the Tennessee, had divided his forces in two for an advance on Vicksburg. One column, under Grant's personal command, marched overland from Grand Junction, Tennessee, into North Mississippi. The object was to draw Confederate forces responsible for the defense of the Vicksburg-Jackson enclave into the northern portion of the state, and there keep them pinned, while the other column, under Major General William T. Sherman, made a rapid push down the Mississippi River and seized Vicksburg. As Grant's column pushed south through Holly Springs and Oxford toward Grenada, this ever-lengthening supply and communication line became dreadfully exposed. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad, on which Grant depended for supplies, fell prey to raiding Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest. His advanced base at Holly Springs also fell victim to raiding Confederate cavalry under Earl Van Dorn. Destruction of the vital rail line and his advanced base at Holly Springs forced Grant to fall back on Memphis. This retrograde enabled Confederate forces utilizing interior rail lines to rush to Vicksburg, arriving in time to thwart Sherman's strike just northeast of the city along the banks of Chickasaw Bayou. In reporting the action, Sherman simply wrote, "I reached Vicksburg at the time appointed, landed, assaulted, and failed." Checked on the overland route, Grant seized upon federal naval superiority on the inland waters to transfer his army to Milliken's Bend and Young's Point, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River just above and opposite Vicksburg. During the winter of 1862-1863, federal forces stockpiled tremendous quantities of food, clothing, medicine, and ammunition, and countless other items for the spring campaign aimed at Vicksburg. Grant also orchestrated a series of ill-fated bio expeditions, what Grant referred to as experiments, the object of which was to reach the rear of Vicksburg. After months of frustration and failure, Grant was at a crossroads in his military career. There was tremendous clamor in the northern press to remove Grant from command. Even members of the cabinet, most vocal of whom was the Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, himself in Ohio, and as too was Grant, urging President Lincoln to replace Grant as commander of the Western Army. But the president responded to those critical of Grant by saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights. I'll try him a little longer." Aware of the clamor against him, Grant examined his options. 3 options were discussed at Army headquarters. The first was to launch a direct amphibious assault across the Mississippi River and storm the Vicksburg stronghold. The second was to pull back to Memphis and try the overland route once again. And the third was to march his army down the west side of the river, search for a favorable crossing point, and transfer the field of operations to the area south and east of Vicksburg. In characteristic fashion and with grim determination, Grant boldly opted for the march south. On March 29, 1863, Grant ordered Major General John McClernand of the 13th Corps to open a road from Milliken's Bend to New Carthage on the Mississippi River below Vicksburg. The movement began 2 days later, and thus the Vicksburg campaign that we're all most familiar with began in earnest. As Grant's infantrymen slogged their way south through Louisiana, corduroying roads and building bridges practically each step of the way, the Union fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, prepared to run by the batteries of Vicksburg, a task deemed impossible by many. On the dark, moonless night of April the 16th, Porter's vessels raised anchor and moved downriver toward the citadel of Vicksburg. With engines muffled and running lights extinguished, Porter hoped to slip past the batteries undetected. But unbeknownst to the Admiral, each and every night the Confederates placed scouts out in skiffs at the head of DeSoto Point to guard against and uncover any attempt by the Union fleet to run by the batteries of Vicksburg. And around 11 o'clock at night, the scouts out in these skiffs saw these huge dark shapes sweeping down toward them and quickly made them out to be Union gunboats and transport vessels. These scouts rowed to either side of the Mississippi River where already barrels of tar, bales of cotton soaked in turpentine had been placed and set them on fire, not only to illuminate the river, but to silhouette the Union fleet as it ran by the batteries. Suddenly, the night sky was ablaze as cotton bales and barrels of tar were set afire. For several hours, the fleet withstood the punishing fire which was poured from Confederate batteries. Admiral Porter paid very close attention as to where the shot and shell were hitting his vessels, and he noticed they were hitting his smokestacks, his wheelhouses and pilot houses, the hurricane deck. A few were getting down to the gun deck, but almost none were getting any lower to where the vital parts of the boats were located, your engines, your steam drums, your mud filters, and so on. And he realized that there must be a fatal flaw in the placement of these Confederate batteries, preventing them from depressing their tubes sufficiently to draw an effective fire on the river. Now, after more than 50 years of study on the Vicksburg campaign, I can assure you, good folks, that when these guns were mounted, they were tested to see if they could hit the far side of the river, which they could easily do. It's well within their range. But I've yet to unearth any evidence to suggest they were tested to see if they could hit the near bank of the river, believing, of course, if they could hit the far side, surely they could hit the near bank. But this fatal flaw in the placement of the batteries was realized by Admiral Porter. And when he came to that realization, he ordered all his vessels to move across the current, hug the Mississippi shoreline, get as close to the guns as possible where you would move into an area of defilade. Now, at first, the pilots and captains of the trailing vessels thought they had misinterpreted the signal flight, but sure enough, here was the Benton, Porter's flagship, moving across the current, and they would follow suit. So close did they come to the Mississippi shoreline that Union sailors reported hearing the commands being given by Confederate gun captains. They could also hear bricks tumbling in the city streets, the effect of their own shell fire. When the shelling stopped, Porter tallied the damage to his fleet and recorded the loss of only one unmanned transport vessel. What was deemed impossible by many had been achieved. With Porter's fleet now below Vicksburg, Grant had the wherewithal to cross the mighty river. It was Grant's intention to force a crossing of the river at Grand Gulf, where there was a good all-weather landing, and from which point roads radiated deep into the interior of Mississippi. The two forts guarding Grand Gulf imposed an obstacle to federal plans. On April 29th, Porter's gunboats bombarded the Grand Gulf defenses in preparation for a landing by Grant's troops. The fleet silenced the guns of Fort Wade, but could not silence those of Fort Coben. Ever adaptive, Grant disembarked his men from the transports and marched them 5 miles farther down the levee. That evening, Porter's fleet ran past the Confederate batteries and rendezvoused with Grant at Disharoon Plantation. From which point, on April 30th and into May 1st, Grant hurled his army across the mighty river and onto Mississippi soil at Bruinsburg. A band aboard the flagship Benton struck up the red, white, and blue as Grant's infantrymen came ashore. In one of the largest amphibious operations in American military history up to that time, Grant landed 22,000 men and began the inland campaign to capture Vicksburg. Once ashore, Grant's forces pushed rapidly inland and marched through the night. In the early morning hours of May 1st, Confederate resistance was encountered west of Port Gibson. In a furious battle which raged throughout the day, Union soldiers fought with grim determination to secure their beachhead on Mississippi soil, while Confederate soldiers fought with equal determination to drive the invaders into the river. But by day's end, the Confederate forces, outnumbered and hard-pressed, retired from the field. Rather than march north on Vicksburg, Grant directed his army in a northeasterly direction. It was his intention to cut the rail line which connected Vicksburg with Jackson and sever that vital line of communication and supply, cutting the Confederate garrison off from all supply and reinforcements. In a 17-day period, what is often referred to as the Blitzkrieg of the Vicksburg campaign, Grant's army marched more than 200 miles, fought 5 battles, and drove the Confederates into the city's defenses. The campaign thus far had been a stunning success for Union forces. Grant's army had met and overcome Confederate resistance at Port Gibson on May the 1st. Raymond on May the 12th, and 2 days later captured the capital of Mississippi. Not wishing to waste combat troops on occupation, Grant neutralized Jackson with the torch. And by that I mean he simply applied the torch to machine shops and factories, cut telegraph lines and railroad tracks. Anything of military value was destroyed. With Jackson effectively neutralized, Grant turned west toward his objective, Vicksburg. En route from Jackson to Vicksburg, his forces inflicted devastating casualties on the Confederate Army under the personal command of Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton at the Battle of Champion Hill on May the 16th. The following day, Grant's forces defeated Confederate soldiers at the Battle of Big Black River Bridge and hurled Pemberton's army back into the defenses of Vicksburg. Having witnessed the debacle at the Big Black River and the wild flight of his troops, Pemberton dejectedly stated, "Just 30 years ago, I began my military career by receiving my appointment to a cadetship at the U.S. Military Academy, and today, that same date, that career is ended in disaster, in disgrace." And for all intents and purpose, it was. But it was a disaster which would affect an entire nation and its people. The citizens of Vicksburg watched in fear as the shattered remnants of Pemberton's army poured into the city on that fateful day. Mrs. Emma Balfour, wife of a prominent Vicksburg physician, stood in her doorway as the demoralized mass of humanity filled the city streets. She later wrote with trepidation, "I hope never to witness again such a scene as the return of our routed army." With pen in hand, she recorded the scenes which enveloped her. From 12 o'clock until late in the night, the streets and roads were jammed with wagons, cannon, horses, men, mules, stock, sheep, everything you can imagine that appertains to an army being brought hurriedly within the entrenchment. She confided to her diary the fears of many in Vicksburg as she wrote, "What is to become of all the living things in this place, shut up as in a trap? Only God knows." On through the long day and into the evening marched the weary soldiers clad in butternut and gray. Singly in small groups with no sense of order or discipline, the men filed into the rifle pits and turned to meet Grant's rapidly approaching army. A medley of sounds filled the night air as the Confederates readied their defenses. Officers shouted orders, teamsters whipped their animals and dragged artillery into position, and as the soldiers worked with picks and shovels, some men cursed while others prayed. Throughout the night, the ringing of axes was constant as additional trees were felled to strengthen fortifications, clear fields of fire, and form an abattis in front of their works. The work continued at a feverish pace, and by sunrise on May the 18th, the city was in a good state of defense. Late in the afternoon, Confederate soldiers peering over their parapets spotted long columns of Union infantrymen moving slowly toward the city. It was a terrifying spectacle, and yet magnificent in the extreme as battle flags snapped in the breeze above the columns and bayonets glistened in the sunlight. Union skirmishers were quickly deployed and artillery roared into action, but the day itself wore away with nothing more than a long-range artillery duel. That night, as darkness enveloped the fields, the soldiers of both armies rested on their arms. Each knew that the bloody work at hand would commence with the rising sun, and prepared for battle, each in his own way. Grant was anxious for a quick victory, and after making a hasty reconnaissance, ordered an attack. Early on the morning of May 19, Union artillery opened fire upon the city and for hours bombarded the Confederate works with solid shot and shell. The thick smoke from the guns shrouded the fields and made it virtually impossible to see. But at 2 p.m., when the guns fell silent, Union soldiers deployed into line of battle astride Graveyard Road northeast of Vicksburg and stormed the city's defenses. They succeeded in planting several stands of colors on the parapets of Vicksburg, but were driven back with a loss of 942 men. In the assault on May the 19th, men of the 1st Battalion, 13th United States Infantry, one of only 2 regular Army units with Grant at Vicksburg, would win renown. That day, under the command of the gallant Captain Edward Washington, grandnephew of George Washington himself, the men of the 1st Battalion lined up. All eyes of the volunteer soldiers turned to see how the regulars would perform this day. As Washington lined up his men and began slowly moving across the fields, they marched through a cornfield, at the end of which, at the edge of the escarpment, was a post and rail fence, a very stout post and rail fence. And so Washington sent men forward to remove the rails, knock the post over, remove that obstruction to the Federal advance. But mind you, it was a very stout post and rail fence, and it could not be dismantled. As a result, when the line of battle approached that fence, it came to a grinding halt. And at that point, the Confederates, taking advantage of the situation, rose en masse and let loose a withering volley, toppling scores of the regulars. Those who were unharmed clambered over the fence and slid down into the ravines. There they encountered the abattis of felled trees. Filtering their way through the obstruction, they began slowly crawling up the opposite slope. As they neared the Confederate works, the flag went down. 17 flag bearers, by the way, were killed or mortally wounded carrying the colors of the 1st Battalion forward that day, a mere 400 yards. But the colors went down, and Captain Charles Ewing, brother-in-law of William T. Sherman, actually picked it up. Wounded by the climb out of the ravine, he sat on a tree stump, raised the flag high over his head to inspire the troops when his thumb was shot off. Without his opposing digit, the flag fell to the ground yet again when a private picked it up, jumped into the ditches fronting the stockade ran, and stabbed the colors into the ground. They were the first Northern unit flag to reach the parapets of Vicksburg. It would also be joined shortly thereafter by the regimental crest. But only a handful of the regulars made it into the ditches, surely not enough to attempt to go over the top and gain control of that fortification. Elsewhere along the line, the Union troops were pinned down well short of their objective. And so throughout the course of the day, the men who had made it into the ditch lived in what one man termed a living grave as the Confederates were hurling cannonballs and hand grenades down upon them. Well, as the regulars were trapped inside the ditch, elsewhere along the line, the Union troops were pinned down by a murderous fire. One regiment in particular, the 55th Illinois Volunteers, led by Colonel Oscar Malmberg. Now, Malmberg was a Swedish immigrant, spoke broken English with a harsh Swedish accent. And during the course of the afternoon, he watched as his supply of ammunition diminished. Not wishing to send men to the rear, believing it to be a suicidal mission, he called for volunteers, and 4 men, including a young musician by the name of Orion Howe, volunteered for the hazardous assignment. And so these 4 men raced down the graveyard road just as fast as their legs could carry them. 3 of the 4 were killed outright. Orion Howe, the only survivor, had taken a mini ball in the back of his leg and was toppled hard to the ground, badly wounded. Undaunted by this wound, the young musician picked himself up, dusted himself off, and continued hobbling down the road when he spotted a familiar figure standing there with binoculars in hand, no less an individual than William T. Sherman, the Corps commander. Howe hobbled up to Sherman, saluted smartly, and began to recount the situation of the troops on the firing line. Now Sherman, gazing down at this young lad, could tell by the ashen complexion on his face, the blood streaming down his leg, that he was badly wounded. Yet he listened intently to Howe's report, and when Howe finished his report, Sherman ordered him to the rear in hospitalization. He said, "I will see to it personally, young man, that a fresh supply of munitions are carried forward." And so as Howe continued hobbling to the rear, he suddenly wheeled about and yelled, "54 caliber!" meaning the size of munitions needed at the front. The 54 caliber munitions were gathered. Volunteers from the 11th Iowa Infantry carried the heavy crates forward, and when we got to the firing line and began to distribute the precious cartridges, they came to the realization it was the wrong size. It was of no use whatsoever. But be that as it may, the attack would have failed, and should not detract from the bravery exhibited by this young man, nor did it. In the aftermath of the siege of Vicksburg, Grant, recalling the bravery of this young lad, thought that he deserved recognition and put him in for a medal. Well, a medal was finally awarded, no less than the Medal of Honor, although it was not approved until 1896, on the day he performed the service for which he was awarded our nation's most coveted award. He was only 14 years of age. Orion Howe is the youngest recipient of the Medal of Honor for action at Vicksburg. 181 Medals of Honor, Army Medals of Honor, were awarded for action at Vicksburg, 6 Navy Medals of Honor. Howe is the youngest. But it may interest you to learn he's not the youngest overall. During the course of the Civil War, 2 12-year-old boys were awarded the Medal of Honor, and to this date, those 2 12-year-olds remain the youngest recipient of our nation's highest award. As the blue lines receded The men of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry, who had reached the ditch, retrieved their colors and fell back. The national colors alone had been pierced by 56 bullet holes. 3 bullets and a piece of canister were embedded in the flagstaff, attesting to Sergeant Gardner's claim that men never stood a hotter fire. The very next day, as Sherman was riding along the lines, he came to the men of the 1st Battalion. This happened to be his very first command at the outbreak of the Civil War. And when he looked down at the paucity of the numbers, he turned to an aide, and with tears streaming down his cheeks, he said, "My God, is that all that's left of the 13th Infantry?" Sadly enough, it was. They lost 43% of their numbers in the assault on May the 19th. When the aftermath of the siege, Sherman would see to it that his own, as they were called, were duly recognized. And as the battle honors were being awarded, he saw to it that the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry were ordered to inscribe on their battle flags not just the honor of Vicksburg, but more specifically, 1st at Vicksburg, for being the first unit to reach the Confederate fortifications. So proud were the officers and men of that singular honor that they adopted it as their unit motto. And to this date, if you ever run into a member of the 13th United States Infantry currently stationed at Camp Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina, you will probably see emblazoned on their shoulder patches the inscription, 1st at Vicksburg. In the attack on May 19th, Grant lost 942 men. Undaunted, he decided to make a more thorough reconnaissance, then hurl his entire force against Vicksburg on May the 22nd. Early that morning, Union artillery roared into action and for 4 hours bombarded the works with solid shot and shell, tearing large holes in the earthen fortifications. At 10 a.m., the prearranged time for the assault to begin, the artillery fell silent. Union soldiers moved forward over a broad 3-mile front toward the defenses of Vicksburg. Again, they succeeded in planting their colors on the parapets of Vicksburg in several areas and made a short-lived penetration at Railroad Redoubt, but were driven back the second time with severe loss. In the assault on May the 22nd, Grant lost over 3,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Now on Sherman's front, which is northeast of the city, in the upper right-hand corner there along the Graveyard Road, his troops had failed on May the 19th. Why? Primarily obstruction of felled trees in their front. And so in preparation for the attack on May the 22nd, Sherman realized that the abattis of felled trees had to be avoided at all costs if the attack were to succeed. But the only open avenue of advance was straight down the Graveyard Road into what the modern army would call the kill zone of the Confederates, a very narrow cut in the road about 100 yards in front of the stockade redan. He was also informed by the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th Infantry, that there was a ditch fronting this work that measured 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide. It was the last obstacle that had to be overcome if the attack were to succeed. But how do you overcome such an obstacle in the presence of the enemy? Well, Sherman devised a plan. He called for his men to construct what were called fascines, simply bundles of cane tied together. Cane grows readily abundant in the creek bottoms all around the Vicksburg area. He would also construct planks and scaling ladders and then have volunteers carrying these bridging materials, if you will, ahead of the infantry. And they could run down the Graveyard Road. When they reached the ditch, throw down the fascines, filling up a portion of the ditch that could quickly be planked over, scaling ladders thrown against the wall, and the infantry in the assault could run down the road, over planks, up the ladders, over top, capture the forts, and gain access to Vicksburg. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Well, as you come to Vicksburg today, you'll see that the park is covered by a dense forest. That dense forest did not exist in 1863. Rather, the dense forest you see today was hand-planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps. There were no trees around Vicksburg as the Confederates had felled large numbers of trees to construct fortifications, clear fields of fire, form obstructions in their front. In similar fashion, when the Union Army arrived from the east, it too cut down vast tracts of forest to open up avenues of assault, construct battery positions, and 100,000 soldiers, the combined strength of these two armies, used an awful lot of firewood to boil their coffee and cook their rations. Where was Sherman going to get the materials to make the planks and the scaling ladders? Well, as he reconnoitered around on the night of May 21st, he spotted a wooden frame building about a mile to the rear. And so he called for volunteers to go down, dismantle that structure, and use those materials for the planks and the scaling ladders. Now, any of you who have ever served in the armed forces of the United States can attest that you never volunteer for anything. Regardless of how simple it may sound, you're going to be in for a burning. And sure enough, Sherman failed to tell these volunteers that the house was occupied, not by disloyal citizens, but by no less an individual than Major General Ulysses S. Grant, the Army commander, who was using the building as his headquarters. Now, you would think when these guys get down there, that the sentries in front of the building would have tipped them off that somebody important was inside. But they began throwing rocks through the windows, ripping boards off the exterior wall, and Grant was inside at that point in time, sound asleep. Now you can imagine the consternation of these volunteers when suddenly they heard a very familiar yet very angry voice demanding to know, "What is going on here?" And out walked Grant in his night clothes. Well, these guys stuttered their way through an explanation. Grant listened patiently, without saying a word, vacated the building, which was leveled in record time after that. The planks, the scaling ladders, the fascines remained. Everything was in readiness for the assault on May the 22nd. And after the guns fell silent, the volunteers raced forward down the Graveyard Road. Scores of them were killed or mortally wounded by Confederate rifle fire. But those true to their mission reached the ditch, threw down the bundles of cane that were quickly planked over, the scaling ladders thrown against the wall. But as they turned to watch the infantry in this assault, were shocked when there were no troops in sight. There was a breakdown in communication, and the order was never issued to the troops to follow the volunteers. By this time, all the concealing smoke had risen, exposing the fields for all to see. Sherman was livid. But as the attack was expected, it would be made, with or without the benefit of the concealing smoke. And so down the Graveyard Road surged the troops of Sherman's 15th Army Corps, only to be hurled back with heavy loss. By day's end, all along this broad front, the Union troops were hurled back, and the breach at Railroad Redoubt was sealed. Although his nose was bloodied a second time, Grant was not yet willing to toss in the towel and lay siege to the city. As he contemplated his next move, Grant left behind his dead and wounded, many of whom had been lying exposed since the 19th day of May. Exposed to the sun, to the heat, the bodies of the dead began to bloat and turn black. As more than one Confederate soldier noted in the pages of his journal, the Yanks are trying to stink us out of Vicksburg with the offal of their dead. On May the 25th, white flags appeared along the Confederate lines, and Union soldiers were hopeful that the city would soon be surrendered. Their hopes were quickly dashed as word spread that a note was passed from Pemberton to Grant, imploring, as it said, in the name of humanity, that Grant bury his dead, for the odor had become quite offensive. A truce was granted for 2½ hours, during which time men in blue and gray mingled between the lines. As one soldier noted, over there a group of 4 played cards, 2 Yanks and 2 Rebs, while others swapped tobacco for coffee. While the gruesome task of the burial details was completed, it was almost as if there was no war in progress. At the appointed time, however, the flags were taken down and everyone ran for cover. The siege of Vicksburg began in earnest that day. Throughout the month of May and into June, Union soldiers slowly extended their lines to the left and to the right until they completely encircled the beleaguered city. Once the line of circumvallation was established, Pemberton's garrison was effectively cut off from all supply and communications with the outside world. The Confederates would have to subsist solely on what they had stockpiled in Vicksburg prior to the siege, and with each passing day, those supplies dwindled until they were nearly exhausted. In order to conserve what food supplies were on hand, Pemberton ordered the daily ration cut to 3/4, then to half, then to quarter. They were then cut again, and yet again, and yet again. By the end of June, the garrison was issued just a handful of peas and rice once a day per man. Even their water was rationed to 1 cup per man per day. And in the heat of a Mississippi summer, the suffering among the troops was intense. Disease began to spread rapidly through the ranks. Dysentery, diarrhea, malaria, and various fevers, they all took a heavy toll of human life and were far more certain of death than were the Union sharpshooters. At first, scores, then hundreds of men could be seen, laying their weapons aside and walk or crawl as best they could to the hospitals in Vicksburg. Public buildings were soon filled to capacity. Many fine private residences were converted to hospitals, but even there was no succor, as medicines were in short supply. Each day, the dead wagons, as they came to be called, made the rounds of the hospital, and the dead were brought out in ever-increasing number and carried as cordwood in the wagons to their long rest in the city cemetery north of town. As May slowly faded into June, Union soldiers began to dig approaches toward the Confederate line, forming zigzags and then parallels. Grant moved up his infantry first to within 300 yards, then 200 yards, then 100 yards, and still the digging continued as Union soldiers worked their way up to the parapets of Vicksburg. 13 approaches were excavated by Union soldiers at different points along the siege lines with the object of mining Confederate works. Of these 13 approaches, the most successful was known as Logan's Approach. Situated along the Jackson Road, Logan's Approach inched forward toward the 3rd Louisiana Redan. Excavating a sap or trench, if you will, that was 7 feet deep and 8 feet wide, Union fatigue parties reached the 3rd Louisiana Redan on June the 23rd, and a gallery was then carved directly under the fort and preparations made for mining. On June 25th, 2,200 pounds of black powder were placed in the mine. At 3 p.m., the fuse was lit. Tense moments passed as the Federals waited to storm into the breach and seize Vicksburg. Suddenly, there was a muffled thud, then a loud explosion as the ground began to break, and a column of flame and dirt reached to the sky. Inside the column of flame, one could actually see men and mules, wagons, artillery pieces blown skyward. Before the dust even settled, Union soldiers poured into the crater and attempted to secure the breach. In the wild melee which ensued, club muskets and bayonets were freely used, and hand grenades were tossed back and forth. The battle raged in unabated fury for 26 hours as Grant threw in one fresh regiment after another, all to no avail. The breach was ultimately sealed by the Confederates at the point of bayonet. The great gamble had failed. Undaunted, a second mine was planted and detonated on July 1st, but was not followed up by an infantry assault. As the Union soldiers are excavating this gallery, the Confederates knew exactly what they were up to. After all you had to do is place your ear to the ground and you can hear the Union soldiers digging directly underneath. And so the Confederates resorted to thinking what were called counter shafts. Shafts within their own works that went straight down 10, 15, 20 feet. At the bottom of these counter shafts, by all accounts, the air was stifling. It was almost impossible to breathe. But at the bottom of the counter shafts, you could actually hear the Union soldiers digging opposite you. You could even make out their conversations. But sounds travel differently below ground than they do on the surface. And although the Confederates could hear the Union soldiers talking opposite them, they could not tell from what direction or from what distance those sounds were coming. All they knew that on June the 25th, the digging opposite them had stopped, which meant only one thing: the mine had been completed, and sure enough it had. Well, as the Union soldiers, after the failed mine explosion on June 25th, are excavating yet another gallery, the Confederates once again sink counter shafts from within their own works. But not wishing to lose additional, irreplaceable white soldiers, they placed 7 blacks under the command of a Confederate corporal down in these counter shafts. And they were in the bottom of these counter shafts on July 1st when a second mine was detonated. Well, 6 of the blacks and the Confederate corporal were buried by the explosion. One of the blacks, a slave named Abraham, was actually blown skyward and landed behind Union lines. Now you can imagine these Union soldiers under arms, waiting for the attack to commence, watching as this black man fell out of the sky behind them. Well, by all accounts, this poor man landed on his head, yet he was completely unscathed, not a scratch on him. Union soldiers quickly ran up to the man, dusted him off. One even had the audacity to ask him, "How high'd you go?" To which this black man responded, "Don't rightly know, but think 3 miles. Well, this guy was an instant celebrity. He was taken back and introduced to General Grant, and for the few remaining days of the siege, some enterprising Union soldiers actually sequestered this man in a tent and charged 25 cents admission for curious soldiers just to gawk at the man who had been blown to freedom. Well, the mine explosion on July 1st was not followed up by an infantry assault. Grant had learned his lesson previously. On that very day, Grant was notified by his subordinates that given just a few more days of digging, all 13 approaches would be completed, at which time 13 mines could be planted and detonated simultaneously. Well, this was the moment Grant and his army had been working toward all these many weeks of siege, and it is not likely that the Confederates could have withstood such an attack. On the hot afternoon of July 3rd, Grant was in the process of planning an attack, which he scheduled for July the 6th. When white flags of truce appeared along the lines, riding out from the city came a cavalcade of officers in gray led by Lieutenant General John Pemberton. Grant rode to meet him between the lines, at which time Pemberton asked Grant on what terms he would receive the surrender of the city and garrison under his command, and Grant replied that he had no terms other than an immediate and unconditional surrender of the city. These terms were unacceptable to Pemberton, who very angrily shook his finger in Grant's face and said, "I can assure you then, General, you'll bury many more of your men before you ever enter into the city of Vicksburg." The generals only agreed upon a cessation of hostilities and pledged an exchange of notes until suitable terms could be worked out, then rode their separate ways. Grant assured Pemberton he would have his final terms by 10 o'clock that night. True to his word, Grant had sent in his final amended terms. Rather than calling for an immediate and unconditional surrender of the garrison, Grant offered parole to the Confederates. Pemberton received the note in the quiet of his headquarters, and in the company of his generals, Pemberton read the note, passed it among his subordinates to read and comment upon. Almost to a man, they agreed these were the best terms that could be had. On the morning of July 4, 1863, white flags fluttered in the breeze above the fortifications of Vicksburg. Marching out from their works, Confederate soldiers furled their flags, stacked their arms, and turned over their accoutrements, at which time a victorious Union Army, here is the 4th Minnesota, entering the city, marched in and took possession of Vicksburg, the fortress city on the Mississippi River, which had eluded them for so long. Grant himself rode in along the Jackson Road and down to the Warren County Courthouse, where he watched as the stars and bars of the Confederacy were lowered to be replaced by the stars and stripes. He then rode down to the city's waterfront, where he personally thanked and congratulated Admiral David Porter for the assistance rendered by the United States Navy during the operations for Vicksburg. Almost as an afterthought, he sent a message to Washington informing President Lincoln of the city's surrender. It took several days for the message to reach the capital, during which time the only remaining Confederate bastion on the Mississippi River, Port Hudson, Louisiana, fell into Union hands. Upon receipt of Grant's message, Lincoln simply sighed. Thank God, the Father of waters again flows unvexed to the sea. And with that, I thank you.